Hi everyone, I'm really excited to welcome you to the first AYAC election forum. I'd like to begin by acknowledging country and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal people and recognising their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I also recognise and acknowledge the traditional owners of country from where you are joining us from today. I pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us at this event, and recognise that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. So my name is Isabel and I'm from the team at the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition. I'm the Vice Chair and a Board Director. We're the national voice and advocate for more than 4.5 million young Australians right across the country. And we're hosting these events with representatives from the major parties so you can hear about what they'll do for young people and ask questions before you vote. We're joined by an Auslan interpreter at this event who you can see on your screen. And if you need help or support during the event, you can use the chat function and one of our team members will help you out. So we're joined tonight by Senator Dorinda Cox from the Australian Greens. We want to thank Senator Cox for filling in at short notice for Senator Jordan Steele-John, who can't make it tonight due to family reasons. Senator Cox is the first First Nations woman to represent Western Australia in the Senate. We're so excited to have you here, Senator Cox, and I want to thank you here for your support. We're going to take questions from the audience in just a moment, but first we'd like you to share, if you can please, why you believe young people should vote for the Australian Greens at this election.
Thanks so much, Isabel, for your warm welcome. And hi, everyone. My name is Dorinda Cox and I'm the Australian Greens Senator based here in Western Australia. And can I say Kaya Wanju, which means hello and welcome in my native tongue from the Noongar language. And I also want to add my acknowledgement of country. So I join you from the lands of the AYAC people here in Boorloo in Perth, where I live and work and raise my kids, and pay my respects to their elders past and present of this nation and many nations that you join me from. And this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And our sovereignty has never been ceded because we have no treaties with the First Peoples of this country. And I'm very proud to be a part of a party that is taking First Nations justice through truth, treaty and voice to the next election. I think that this is a wonderful event, and I'm so humbled and privileged to be stepping in for my fellow colleague, Senator Jordan Steele-John, who is both my colleague but also my friend, who we worked together in the Parliament with in the Australian Greens party room. This election is a young people's election. The result of this election will impact on the lives of young people in this country. Absolutely in no way, shape or form has ever a previous election done before. The two major parties have sold out young people and they're vowing to make it worse. And as a mum of two daughters, I am absolutely looking forward to being in the next parliament to be able to make change on behalf of young people. Unfortunately, the two major parties continue their work because they want to have plans to open up 114 new coal and gas mines. These are climate bombs that will continue to destroy our environment and our planet. They will keep introducing further tax breaks and push housing further out of reach for the next generation and generations to come. The climate crisis and the rampant inequality will get worse under these two major parties. Also, going to the dentist is going to cost thousands. I know that this is a continued issue both for young people but for all Australians. And too often we can't get mental health care when we need it. It's also too expensive. So that's why we're advocating to get this back into Medicare. Young people are fierce and inspirational, and they aren't going to accept the discrimination of the past. This is not a time to despair and throw your hands up in the air and say, this is all too hard, because it's your future. But you know what? You're going to have to fight for it. In just 9 days, we could correct that course on the issues that really matter, particularly on climate, or we can continue down the destructive path that has been laid for us by those two major parties. For our climate, it is a make or break time. And I'm telling people in this federal election to absolutely vote like your life depended on it, because it actually does. For your cost of living, it's now or never. And what we know from the UN's IPCC report It says that if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we must, for our own survival, need to take climate action right now. Our balance of power message, which we hope will get us not just in the Senate, but also in the House of Representatives to represent you alongside the next government, is that we have the opportunity to take the power back. They have what's called a hung parliament, which means that there isn't one major party that governs. In fact, it means that there are minor or smaller parties and what the independents make up or form government. And this is likely to be the outcome at the next federal election. But you have the power to do that. And by putting the Greens in a position, we will absolutely be able to make what we hope to be a Labor government, to say no to new coal and gas projects, to turn WA into a cleaner, greener, renewable energy powerhouse, cap rents and build 1 million homes nationally, including 118,000 of those new homes right here in WA. We also want to get mental health and dental care back into Medicare. And this was possible because we did this under the Gillard government when we were in balance of power with them in the Senate. We want to wipe student debt. We want to raise the minimum wage, and we want to deliver the services that we all need in order to have a better life. So I hope that you, the young people of Australia, will help us, the Australian Greens, to achieve this, to fight for a future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Cox. That was so inspiring. Hopefully we'll pick up some of those points that you've talked around, especially on climate action and decarbonisation, the cost of living, all of that in some questions that we'll have for you soon. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Luke from the AYAC team, who's going to share some of his questions that have been sent in from the audience.
Thanks, Isabel, and thanks, Senator Cox. We really appreciate you sharing all of that detail with us. Just to pick up on something you noted in your pitch, I noticed you spoke about wiping student debt. It'd be really interesting to hear a little bit more about what you're proposing there.
Thanks, Luke. Sorry, I'm just shuffling with my notes here. Sorry.
While you do that, Senator, if anyone is with us in the Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature down the bottom of the toolbar to ask any questions you have for the Senator, or you can pop your questions in the chat and someone from the team will grab them for you. And we'll be happy to ask those questions. But otherwise, Senator, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, Luke. So in the frame of addressing the cost of living issues and wiping student debt, it's a very, very important issue. We know that HECS debts are one of the major things that lead young people into debt and into debt for a long period of time. We know that having an educated workforce helps us to stimulate the economy. And we know that in order for us to do that, we need to make sure that we are providing free education. And this is all possible if we're able to not just offer that through universities, but also through our TAFE system. So we need to make sure that we are not just providing free education, but also making sure we're wiping student debt for people who are already in the system. And the only way we can do that is if we tax the billionaires who don't pay enough tax in this country in order to make sure that that free education is possible for the next generation. But wiping student debt is absolutely a priority for us in the next iteration of government.
Thanks, Senator. And as someone with quite a lot of student debt, I would definitely appreciate that debt being wiped. To go to that broader point there around cost of living, we put out our election poll very recently of about 500 young people right across the country, and we asked them what is going to influence their vote at this election. And the number one thing we heard was cost of living, which has been replicated in plenty of polls before this election. Can you share a little bit more about what the party is planning to do to address cost of living increases for young people?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Really, really important question. And I think what we learned from the COVID pandemic And I had the privilege of sitting on the COVID committee and hearing directly about some of the issues, and absolutely the poor leadership that we had at the federal government level around how we were able to stabilise the economy, how, we left particularly young people in our economy behind. We're not looking at wage growth. We're not looking at how we support young people who were the worst affected during the pandemic in relation to their economic status, because they were the ones who were casual workers or part-time workers, or who were the first that were laid off, or working in hospitality areas. So they were affected by lockdowns and aspects that put additional pressure onto the cost of living for them. So we know that that was a very significant issue. We also know that the rates of unemployment affected young people disproportionately. And so we know that even during that 2 years of the pandemic, we didn't do anything to address that. And so, and when I say we, I mean the governments of this country didn't do anything to address that. So compounding, HECS debt, unaffordable housing, being unemployed or being affected by the pandemic because of your employment status, all contributed to the major factors for young people in this pandemic in particular. And we know that it also contributed to the mental health issues and the long COVID, which is now being experienced by some of those young people. So it is an ongoing effect, I think, from what seems to be the hangover from the pandemic. So something that we really need to address. And in this election, we can actually build or bring in a government that is actually looking at this issue and actually taking it into consideration from a young person's perspective.
Senator, I think you've just spoken really articulately to the point that oftentimes young people aren't really meaningfully considered in decision making. And I suppose oftentimes the way that most people exercise their democratic right of having a political voice is through voting. Given the fact that people under the age of 18 don't have that right, how would you suggest we get young people's voices heard more directly in the political process?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue, and I think it's time for us to sit and listen. And I think that as a politician, the thing that we do is we often talk too much. And so we have a tendency to ramble or to speak over people in a way that is, we've got lived experience as adults. And for me, one of the biggest learnings I've had is to sit with the school, students for climate action and listen and hear exactly what the impact will be for them, not just right now, but also in the future, and what some of those hopes and visions are for them. And I think that what we have to do is we have to build a democracy that actually allows them to participate more effectively. And I think in order for us to do that, we need to make the space. And I think the way that we can do that is we can actually create institutional settings that actually do that. And I think that, whether it be youth councils or youth committees or youth parliaments, we need to be thinking more effectively about how we actually enshrine that as part of our democracy. And I think that that's an important factor, because some of these decisions are going to be long lasting, and they should include young people's voices. And I think that what we haven't done is we haven't built a space for young people to tell us exactly what they think, and to participate in that decision making from an informed position, to make sure that we are taking that into consideration.
I suppose maybe as a quick follow-up, you touched on changing some of those institutional settings. Would you support lowering the voting age to maybe 16 years old?
I would definitely support that. I think that the younger we can get people involved in political life and political decision making is a very bold move, but it's also a very progressive move. What we would then hope to achieve is that people start to listen to the voices of young people and start thinking about those long-lasting impacts. And I think that the only way we can do that is we can actually move to a bolder, more vision, blue sky thinking in a way that is about, what does generational change look like? How do we build policy or legislation that can actually take into consideration what that impact looks like? Because when we talk about 2050 targets, Unfortunately, I will be quite an old woman by then, and I will have children. Well, I have children now, but I will have grandchildren who this will affect. So I want my children to participate in some of that thinking, but I also want people who are on the cusp, and we know that 400,000 new people will be voting in this, young people will be voting, turning 18 for the first time, voting in this federal election, which means that we have a real opportunity to hear those young people's voices for the first time, unfortunately. And for me, I think that we're a little bit too late. So if we are hoping to make sure, particularly from a climate perspective, our climate change action is progressive, but it is in line with taking into consideration the impact that it'll be for the next generation, we need to make sure we are hearing this much earlier.
Thanks, Senator. And this question comes from someone who has registered for this evening's event. How can we boost the number of people with disabilities, both in state and federal government?
Well, what we know is that disabled people in particular have been shut out of our policy and decision making for far too long in this country. And I'm so proud to be a part of a party who has a senator who has a disability, and Jordan is a remarkable individual, but also a great advocate and ambassador for the disabled community. So we need to make sure that we are committed to centering those needs and those voices of disabled people around disabled policy as well. So we can't be making policy as able people and saying that it is for disabled people. I think if we want to be proactive and we want to create affirmative action in the future, we actually need to be invested in that. So understanding that when I speak from a place of lived experience, it's when I talk about gender equality as a woman, when I talk about First Nations issue as a First Nations person. So these have to be the introduced quotas or the introduced legislation and places that we create for people who have that lived experience, and we can apply that through intersectional identities as well. We need to make sure that we are being intersectional in our approach. And I don't mean that as a labeling type of identity. It is about meeting people where they're at and understanding how their lived experience can be so nuanced across many intersectional identities that we need to now start creating our policies around that, rather than thinking that we can pigeonhole people into different identities. So I think that we have a lot of work to do. And for me, the Parliament should be an extension of society. So we should be thinking about the diversity that is represented in our communities and what that looks like, because we will be a much better place for it. And so the diversity that we represent, particularly within my party room, as 20% of First Nations women are part of that party room, people with disabilities, LGBTIQ+, other women of colour, there's a mix of us that have intersectional identities that are part of that party room. And we think that diverse mix is what helps us to represent the community much better.
Senator, this is also an audience question. What will the Greens do to support young minority students, including refugee and migrant students and international students?
I think what we're hoping to do is make sure that our plan for young people crosses some of those intersections. So when we talk about refugee and migrant students, we make sure that we are committing to, and the figure that we've committed to, in fact, is a further $10 million per year for a multicultural fund which will benefit called and migrant students. So we're actually saying that these grants that we can put into the system will actually promote social cohesion through innovation, education, and intercultural cooperation. We also want to empower organisations to ensure that the voices of culturally and linguistically diverse people are meaningfully included in policy and in practice design. So we don't just want it to be a side dish. We want to make sure that it's centred in the way that we can make sure that it's crossing all of those intersections and taking all of those, as I said, lived experiences into consideration. So we can't just continue to say that it will be fixed by somebody else. We need to enshrine this in an institutional way that will remove some of those blockages.
Thanks, Senator. And this question isn't one that's been pre-submitted. It has been shared by one of our members from the team at Think Forward. They're calling for a parliamentary inquiry into intergenerational fairness. Can I ask, would you support, and would the Greens support, a parliamentary inquiry looking into intergenerational fairness?
Yes, we would, absolutely. I'm just getting up my notes on this one. So I've got this sentence there. We don't have a formal position on creating an inquiry, but I know that the Australian Greens did put forward an inquiry in 2021 to explore the impacts for the last 3 years on young people, and our example of that was the impact of COVID, the climate crisis and insecure work. But this was actually pushed back by the coalition government and by Labor. So we are the only party that's looking at those systemic issues that are impacting on young people, but also that we want to make sure that if we are triggering a parliamentary inquiry into intergenerational fairness, it's consistent with taking all of those factors into consideration. I think that there are systemic problems in relation to the issues that are presented for young people, and I think what we have to do is make sure that we are taking all of them into consideration and making sure that that we are presenting good policies that actually are presented to the young people in a way that can talk about what is that impact for the next generation and what is the intergenerational fairness that is attributed to that to engage young people and their voices.
And Senator, picking up on one of the main themes, I think, from your introductory pitch, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about climate action and what that looks like, and particularly, I think, what the Greens Party is doing or will do about reducing carbon emissions.
Yeah. What I know as a First Nations person is that we can't heal country and heal the land without contributing to the leadership of the people, whose culture has been sustaining this country for 65,000 years, and that's my people. And so what we need is First Nations leadership on an issue that is about how we understand the health of land and country, and how it's intrinsically linked with the health of the environment, but also the health of people. So living on country, living within a community that is thriving, with all of its basic needs being met from a social justice perspective, are so important, and that when we genuinely care for country and we nurture country, it nurtures us. So when it's being destroyed, we in fact are creating a destructive environment, which we all feel because we all live in and amongst that environment. What we know is that mining and the burning of particularly coal and gas is the key reason why we're facing the climate crisis at the moment. We know that we're in that critical decade period where climate action is absolutely imperative, and we need to make sure we're keeping coal and gas in the ground where it belongs. So it's time to make and stand on the right side of history, and that's why I'm the mining and industry spokesperson for portfolio holder for the Australian Greens, and it's time that those 114 coal and gas projects are absolutely squashed after the election, because we can't afford to keep investing in those. We can't afford to keep making an investment into what we know to be a destructive pathway into the future for future generations. But we know that those major parties, and the Liberal and Labor Party, don't have a plan to get out of coal, and they continue to take those political donations, unfortunately, from those big coal and gas corporations. And so what that does is creates that lobbying, it creates the infiltration into politics by those corporations, and they dictate a lot of the policy platforms that are then introduced into the parliament. But what we can do in the balance of power is absolutely make sure that we are banning the construction of new coal and gas projects, and also, more importantly, the infrastructure that is funded from that. So the infrastructure is ever so important to stop us actually developing and then approving projects in the future. And we need to make sure that we're transitioning to that net zero, carbon neutral energy to maintain that care for a safe climate. And I can't relay to you how important that is. But we also need to make sure we're getting 100% renewable electricity by 2030. We can make all of that possible if we make those big corporations pay for the damage that they're doing to our environment. We look after people who are making that transition from coal communities. And we can do that with a job-for-job guarantee. So we're not putting the financial burden back onto people who know that they have relied on this workforce for such a long period of time, and their communities have relied on this. So our job-for-job guarantee actually makes that an assurance through a levy with the federal government to make sure that people can transition into a renewable energy job rather than remaining in coal and gas. So this is a really important time for us, but we have to start moving on that, and we have to start understanding how the system is geared to make sure that the average Australian is not aware that they pay more tax than the multinational companies in this country, and that each one of our young people that work in casual, part-time work are also paying more tax than those multinationals because they have a lot of tax credits, which means they won't pay until the mid-2030s in relation to their tax bill. But we can stop that if we're in the balance of power, if we are working with the next government to make sure that they pay their fair share of tax, and we can put that back into services that young people and all of our Australian community needs.
Thanks, Senator. And I was going to ask you about those transitions and the types of jobs that might be created, but you've already answered that. You're way ahead of me, so thank you for that. The next question comes from the audience. This person's asked, the Greens party room includes 60% women, which is higher than any other party. How does the Greens party aim to leverage this statistic to encourage young women and girls to pursue a career in politics? And I should note, another group of our members, Raise Our Voice, have just put out an amazing survey which has shared some pretty scary figures about young women's experience viewing politics over the past 12 months, and the fact that there's a large number of women now who aren't necessarily considering a career in politics because of what they've seen. So how do you hope to potentially turn that around for young women watching and for young women that might want a career in politics in the future?
Well, I would only encourage young women to participate in public life and in politics. I think that what we have seen in relation to what happened in the Parliament in the past few years and the inaction of previous governments, particularly the coalition government, have been extremely disappointing and have been very discouraging, I think, for Australian women on the whole. What I heard is not just that this is all a young people's election, but it's also a women's election coming up, and that women will determine who the next government will be in this country. And I would encourage young women to think about the only way we can make change is to be on the inside, and that, having 60% of our party room being women is a pretty big achievement. And I will say that on behalf of the Australian Greens, but it's a continual culture that we fight within the Parliament as well. And so we have to keep each other safe, and we have to work with the good men that are, I can say safely, part of my party room, who are striving to provide good leadership on this issue. And there are parties that are trying to do their own internal work. What I think is, on the whole, is that the Parliament needs to grasp the concept that we are the federal leadership, and we have a responsibility to make sure that in our leadership of the country, we are modelling that respect for women in all workplaces, including within the walls of the Parliament. And so I would encourage young women in particular to think about a life in politics, but also to think about what is the change that they would like to make as part of that participating, and whether it doesn't need to be in federal politics, it can be in local government, it can be in state parliament, or it can be in federal politics, but participating in public life or politics is a really, it's an absolutely refreshing conversation that you have. I won't say that it's easy, because quite constantly you are always challenged about being a woman, but you strive to make a difference. And I think that it is a safe place now, because there are lots of women who continue to come into the parliament. I think we are seeing an extraordinary amount of women candidates in this federal election, and that we will continue to add more women to the parliament until we're full to the brim and we can get the job done.
Senator, I think that is so important. I think it's so important that women support women, but I also think it's so important that men support women as well. I'd like to ask you a question about supporting the youth sector. So what will the Greens do to support the youth sector to ensure young people can receive support from youth organisations?
Really great question, Isabel. And I think that the Greens plan is to empower more young people and youth organisations. So we want to reinstate funding, particularly for the National Youth Week. We noticed that there has been a reduction in that under the coalition government. We want funding for a youth peak body to have representation across all states and territories. So we have committed to a 1.2 million funding for peak organisations across states and territories. The re-establishment of the Federal Minister for Youth, independent of sport and children, and also that, the issue we've already talked about, so making sure that we give voice and agency to young people and the right to vote. So lowering that age to 16 and 17-year-olds, I think, will have a significant impact on how we support the youth sector. I also think that we need further investment in youth mental health organisations which are in crisis, and we need to ensure that that's part of the brief when we go into getting mental health back into Medicare. So it means we need to get it fully covered, and we need to make sure that the appointments are free. We need to make sure that there are no limits on appointments, because we know that these are some of the existing hurdles, but also these are the things that are contributing to much more dire consequences in our communities, particularly First Nations communities.
Thanks, Dorinda. I really appreciate that. And I should say we really appreciate the long-term support for Youth Peak and funding for AYAC. That's a long-term conversation we've had with Senator Steele-John, and we're really appreciative of that. We're going to wrap up in just a moment, because we promised these events would be short and sharp, and we've just gone over half an hour. Before we do that, I'd just like to ask if there's anything else you'd like to share with young people watching, or maybe looking at this recording later, before they go to the polls.
Absolutely. I think that my message to you as you head to the polls, and I think I've already said it, that 400,000 new young people, new 18-year-olds will be participating in voting this year and in this federal election. And it's really important that I want you to think about the future that you would like to see for the next generation, and that the decision is yours. The democracy needs to be back in your hands. And as young people, the impact will be most felt by you. And so I want you to think about using your vote wisely. When you enter into the polls, if you were like me as a young person, my dad was the first person who taught me how to vote when I was 18. And I voted Labor because my dad voted Labor. And I wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I realised that I actually didn't align myself with that party's values anymore, and that I needed to go away and think about where my vote counted and where it mattered and what those policies look like, because they were impacting on me. And my vote does matter. And the only way we're going to make our vote matter is if we take that vote and collectively change the future. And for young people, that is in your hands right now, and in no pressure whatsoever. But this federal election is a generational election. And I want to say that if we all want to stand on the right side of history, we need to encourage young people to participate in our democracy. We need to make space for them, and we need to hear their voices. And so as your Australian Green Senator for Western Australia, I want to make sure that I'm hearing your voice and I'm representing you in the best way I can in the Australian Parliament. So thank you.
Thanks, Dorinda. I really appreciate that. And on behalf of the whole team at AYAC and everyone listening in, thank you for sharing everything and answering all of these questions. We really, really appreciate it. And I hope the next week and a half of the campaign goes really well. Just to wrap up for everyone, thank you so much for attending. We're going to be running 2 more of these forums next week. The next one is with the Liberal National Party and Assistant Minister Luke Howarth on Monday evening. And the one after that is with the Australian Labor Party with Amanda Rishworth on Wednesday evening. You should be able to find the links to those at the same link online in the same events. All I'll say is if you would like to hear more about these types of events after the election, please become a member of the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition. You can find a link to join in the chat or on our website. And we're also going to share a feedback link in the chat right now. We really appreciate your feedback and it helps us to run more of these events. So please fill that out when you get the time. Otherwise, have an amazing evening and we'll see you at the next event.